My name is Aleksander Stawicki. I'm the president of the Competition Law Commission of the UIA, and on behalf of the entire organizing team, I would like to welcome you very warmly to this session on managing of legal risk through compliance programs. We have decided to put up this session because we all strongly believe that compliance is one of the hottest topics for lawyers nowadays, for lawyers working in-house, for lawyers working in the legal practice, but also for lawyers working at the authorities, because you will see that there is more and more authorities that are discussing how to reward companies for compliance efforts. So this is really a very important subject for the entire legal world. I remember myself that a few years ago when we have put a series of seminars on compliance for our clients, the interest was moderate. But nowadays, I would say that more or less 50% of my time is devoted to compliance issues. And you could also say Poland is just a small country somewhere in Central and Eastern Europe, so maybe it's not the best mark. But I think the best proof that this subject is important is the fact that for the next year Congress, compliance is one of the main themes. So we are in a way an appetizer for the next year's Congress. We have, just briefly to introduce you on how we structured our session, we have divided into 3 panels, all are filled with really excellent experts. First, we will have a panel, a more general panel on compliance, and we will try to answer the question what it really is, what is a compliance program, and how to structure an effective compliance program, because I think it's a very interesting question. The second panel will be devoted to handling of concerns. What I'm always telling to my clients is that if you really implement the compliance program well, you may be 100% sure that sooner or later you will have problems, or you will discover problems, because that's how compliance works. And then the most difficult issue probably is how to handle those concerns. Because on one hand, you have lots of various complex legal issues related to handling of concerns, data protection, employment, etc. On the other hand, it's also a question of certain politics, because if you react too strongly, you may discourage people from reporting further offenses. If you do not attach sufficient importance to these discovered problems, then people may simply not do it again. So handling of concerns is an extremely important part of an efficient compliance program, and that will be devoted to the second panel. And then normally when you have a problem, there's a whistleblower coming and reporting something, there is an investigation by the authorities into your business, then what you will normally do, and what happens more and more often, you will have an internal investigation. So the business itself has to know really well, understand really well, what is the potential problem, what is the magnitude of potential problem, what can we do with this, and for that you need an internal investigation, and that will be the third panel. The third panel will discuss how to conduct an effective internal investigation. And in this panel, we will have 4 speakers presenting a real-life cases to illustrate this issue. So, to cut the long story short, that's the brief introduction to this session. And I will start now the first panel that is devoted to the compliance itself and the meaning of compliance. We have agreed among the speakers that as we are that many of us, I will not try to memorize the CVs, all of us, because it will take me probably a week. So I will simply ask all of you just to say 2 or 3 words. I mean, introduce yourself and say 2 or 3 words about yourself, and then we will start the discussion. Thanks.
Okay, I'm Patricia Lopez Ofranc. I'm a partner with Marble, O'Farrell & Maral in Argentina, and I've been working at the UIA in different commissions since 1994.
Good morning, my name is Thijs Klauberg. I'm a partner in the Central Eastern European law firm B&T Attorneys at Law, and I'm from Latvia. And whenever I say I'm from Latvia on this conference, and people confuse it with Lithuania, so in Spanish it's Letonia. And if you don't learn anything from my presentation today, maybe you can learn this. The Baltic states are alphabetical. It's Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, north to south.
Hi, I'm Atul Dua. from India, from a firm Seth Dua and Associates. I'm from New Delhi. I'm actually handling tax matters and competition law matters where there's a whole lot of compliance. So I was also involved with a matter involving the largest accounting fraud which took place in India where the top management was involved. So that case study I'll take up in the third session. Thank you.
Hello, good morning everyone. I'm Victor from Barcelona. I deal especially with privacy law. I'm a member of the commission from the UIA of digital rights. So I'm happy to be here with all this panel.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. So starting with a very general question of compliance and what is compliance, I would like to start with asking you to comment on the following. That basically, in my understanding, compliance can mean two different things. Compliance can be a tool to manage legal risk. And when you manage legal risk, it means that somehow you agree that this risk can materialize sooner or later. You take it, but you simply want to understand this risk and manage it, somehow to take an effective measure to minimize its exposure, but you still somehow agree that this risk can materialize. So that's one possible approach to compliance. And the second possible approach to compliance is that if you are compliant, that means that you simply do not allow yourself to breach the law. So there's a different emphasis. You simply say, I'm a compliant company, so it's not within my culture to assume that I can take legal risk. I don't want to break the law. And to give you a good example on that, in competition law, you often get a question, should I file a merger notification with the competition authority or not? And then those companies that take the first approach to compliance, which is to manage legal risk, when they sometimes hear that, okay, there is a formal obligation, but you could probably argue that you don't have to file, the fine is not really huge, even if you do not comply, then they say, okay, I will take the risk, I will not file. And then there's the second type of clients which say, it's not even a question whether I should file or not. I'm a compliant company, I have a compliance program, and that means that I cannot really breach the law. And that means I have to file, even if it's burdensome, I have a lot of extra cost, there's no real impact, but still, I'm a compliant company, so I'm filing this notification. And that's, for me, the best description between these two approaches to compliance. So my first question for the panel would be, what does this really mean for you to be compliant? And whether you think that compliance is the approach A or approach B, or maybe for different areas of law, it could be both.
Alexander, I think what you made was a very relevant comment, but I think that there may be a third possibility. As lawyers, we know that the law is getting increasingly difficult, increasingly unclear. So in many cases, companies are compliant companies, want to comply, but then all of a sudden they realize that they may not have complied with, because interpretations have changed, etc. So this is a larger problem in a sense that the simple, clear, white or black decision of I want to be a compliant company. Even if you want to be a compliant company, sometimes you have to have very, very serious mechanisms in place to identify the risks. I don't know whether my colleagues want to make some other comment.
Well, I would like to make another comment, another aspect that is quite relevant, I think, in this respect, that a lot of companies, of course, are not acting only in one country, but they are now acting in many countries, and especially in the region where I work in Central Eastern Europe, where companies have moved into several jurisdictions over a course of a very short time, maybe 10, 25 years. They have to deal with a vast variety of different legal cultures, mentalities, and also let's say technicalities. Of course, it's a completely different issue if you roll out a compliance program in a country like Estonia with 1 million inhabitants, or in Russia with 140, and it's also a technical difference because Russia is the biggest country in the world and Estonia is as big as Austria. So I think there are several things to take into account when you implement compliance programs. And especially for large corporations, global corporations, it's probably not enough just to have one rule book.
Yeah, from my point of view, talking about privacy in Spain, from my experience, what I know is that especially companies, they really don't have much culture about privacy. So in Spain, we have one of a law about privacy who has one of the highest fines in Europe, which go up to 600,000 euros. And this is, from my point of view, the main reasons why they have to, why they are willing to comply. And it's not a culture thing. It's just if they do it, if they don't do it, they might be fined. So, from my point of view, this is the reality that we find nowadays in Spain talking about privacy.
I would say that having a compliance program is more of a proactive approach rather than a reactive approach. And maybe 10 years ago in India, people would not even know what is this thing called a compliance program. But with a lot of multinationals coming to India, this culture has come into India, and now even large Indian corporations, some of them are multinationals, do have compliance programs, and some of them have dedicated compliance officers as well.
This is also a function of globalization. I think we've had multinationals for a long time, but these days, on the one side, enforcement has become much more globalized, and controlling what's going on global is important. I remembered some time ago I was talking in particular about corruption and compliance, and I came up with a phrase that was quite successful at the time, and it was when corruption in your backyard knocks at your front door. Because for many years, many companies were not particularly interested of what was happening somewhere far away, but nowadays, when something explodes, it's really an impact on the stock exchange of wherever you are. So all of a sudden, you have to analyze risks, prioritize risk, and see how you're going to deal with these risks.
Well, I think that we have touched upon really important issues. I mean, I would strongly agree with everything what has been said. I think that really, I mean, what Victor mentioned in the beginning, it's only a question of being afraid of a fine. And here the increase enforcement of law in many areas, the fact that now you have huge fines for competition law violations, for violations of other areas of law, that people more and often go to jail for simply breaching the law, it's like the first impulse to start to be compliant. But my experience is that normally when you do this first step, you start to understand more and more that compliance can bring much more than just avoiding a fine. And then the next step is somehow to move into the management of risk, because you suddenly realize that this risk can be identified, you can put certain gravity to each of the risks, and you can see whether you can manage this risk or not. So that's probably the next step. And then the third step for certain companies is to move compliance from strictly not breaching of the law to being this part of your identity. Somehow, when you are compliant, you send a certain message to the world. We, as a company X, do comply with laws. So somehow this would be like a gradual evaluation of approach to compliance programs, and at least that would be my experience. I don't know whether you would agree with that or not.
I totally agree. I really do think that it's really important to start working on compliance with the startups and with the people who are entrepreneurs, as I would say, that from the beginning they start to think about compliance. In that sense, when they grow up, it's going to be more easier for them to be in this culture, because from my field in privacy, privacy is like a way for the user to make a decision, because nowadays most of the companies, as you might know, there's a lot of things going on with privacy, and a way to make a decision might be if the company complies or does not. So if we start working with the startups, with the small companies, I think this is the best way to begin, because when the company is too big, sometimes it's really difficult to change the way they work, no?
But if the company is too big, I think the way to be successful is when you really embed this in the culture of the company. It's not just ticking off that you have a code of conduct or whatever, unless it is embedded in the culture and unless there is a clear tone from the top, most probably the program will not be effective. So it takes time to create a culture. Every company has a culture. So what you have to make sure is that the culture that you are producing is in compliance with compliance.
And that's another very important point that I wanted to make, to ask you about. This is the culture, the real culture of compliance. And then my question for the panel would be, and you have already mentioned the one of the requirements for this. I mean, the tone from the top, the involvement of the top management into compliance issues. So how do you see from your experience what is really important? If you would like to name few things that really make the compliance program becoming part of the corporate culture, what would be those issues from your perspective?
Well, if I can come back to my cross-border element in implementing compliance programs, I think some of the suggestions that I would have if large corporations are, or also small corporations are implementing compliance programs in different jurisdictions would be that they really have to work and ask and work with local management. They have to ask local management what actually works. I mean, in the end, you don't want to just translate a rule book, which of course happens quite often, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen it as well. You have a large global corporation coming into several countries, and somewhere in Washington, they just work out a rule book, and then they send it to you and say, well, why don't you check if it's in compliance with local law, and can you translate it into local language?
Well, if I can interrupt, sometimes it's even more funny, because they tell you, we know that there will be probably some differences, but for us, uniformity is the key. So really don't bother to make some adjustment to make it in line with the Polish law, because Poland is not really important. Compliance is important. Poland is not important. So don't do it. And then you find yourself in a very awkward situation where you try to explain to the people that, in fact, your mother company is telling you that Polish law is not really important. Compliance is important. So sometimes it's even going a step further than this.
Well, to agree with this also, I mean, I was faced in a situation where the code of conduct was very beautiful, really well drafted, but it had never been translated into Polish, for example. So I mean, you can't expect everybody to understand the code of conduct or any rules, and you wonder whether there was any training or anything if they haven't even bothered. And the claim was, well, we can't translate this into 20 languages. This is an issue.
But just to follow up with a couple of suggestions that may be of interest, I mean, from I guess all of us have experiences, but coming from very small jurisdictions, and I guess in Poland it's similar, countries that have only recently introduced these type of compliance procedures, I think they pose specific problems because, as I said, a rule book that is devised somewhere else in the West, in America, doesn't necessarily work. And one example is a large supermarket chain that we've worked with, and they have implemented a whistleblower hotline, and I think over 8 years there was one call. So, I mean, this is all over Central Eastern Europe. So apparently it doesn't really, or everything is fine. That's of course also the possibility. But suggestions, as I said, ask local management. You have to work with local management. You have to see what really works. I mean, these guys know that they also know what would be a little bit too much. The last thing that you want is, of course, more bureaucracy in the organization, and in the end, the company is not making less money. I think very obviously you have to ask local lawyers, and this is not only because we're all lawyers and we want to be asked, but I think lawyers have a good feeling for what works and how far you really have to, you know, what you have to do. And also, of course, local lawyers can say what really is a problem in that local jurisdiction. I mean, something that may be a problem in America may not necessarily be a problem in Latvia or in Poland, I suppose. And the last point would be, I think you have to also check, evaluate, and adapt the compliance programs over the years. I think if it's one year okay to have a certain procedure in a company, it may 5 years later not be the case anymore. So you have to train and you have to involve the staff as well, because if only the management knows what's going on, then that is not probably not very efficient in the company. So these are a few points.
That's very important. I truly agree. I fully agree, and I think that this is quite striking that probably 80% of the clients do this exercise once, and then they forget about their own compliance program, and that's of course not the way to make it part of your culture.
Yeah, I mean, two things. One, compliance is like security in labor. You have to check it every day or every so often because you give them the equipment and then they don't use it. Another thing that I want to stress is that putting in place a compliance program doesn't mean just training people not to breach the law, but it also may require that you coordinate with people providing the information about the company, technology people, because you want, for example, a compliance officer to be able to push a couple of buttons and get coherent information to see whether something doesn't fit into the pattern. I helped a company put in place a compliance program, and they realized while we were working on the compliance program that the company worked in silos, so that the information each area had was for itself. And it was very difficult to have a really across-the-board panorama. So it may be necessary very often to work with other sections of the company so that the compliance program is really meaningful.
Yeah,
yeah, another thing which is important, despite the compliance culture being embedded in the company and people just don't do it because of the fear of getting caught. But other thing which is very important is the cost of compliance. And that's where a management has to play a big role sometimes, especially if it's, say, a local subsidiary in India. They would see that filing for a merger notification under the competition law, although it may be a doubtful case of filing, they would see that the filing fee is 700,000 euros or 5 million rupees. And then they would decide, okay, let's take an opinion from a lawyer that it's not required and let's not spend that money.
Just to sum up a bit, you were talking about a lot of things that I think they are really important on compliance. One of the things is what you talk about, compliance embedded into the culture of the company. I would like to say it from my area that there's a new concept that we call privacy by design, which is a concept that is already it's going to be mandatory, hopefully next year, and it means that any solution that means like processing of personal data, the design and the privacy has to be taken into account at the moment that this solution is already, it's been thinking about this solution. So I think that's a good example of concrete things, special things that even small companies can take into account from the beginning. And another thing that I would like to say is that compliance, it's really important, laws are really important, but I think for lawyers it's really important to understand the company itself, because when we come to a small company, I'm sorry about talking about small companies, but I think they are really important, no? Because they are going to be the big companies from the future, so I think it's really important to talk about them, not multinational, just a small entrepreneur that has an app or whatever, so something really humble, you might say, but this is the right moment to do this, I think. And as I said, it's really important to understand them and to try to talk them in their own words. So especially, as I said, the privacy in Spain, we have really high standards, but we have to tell them in their own words and tell them things that they really understand and they think it's something that they can take profit of, because otherwise it's just a matter of money, it's just a matter of compliance, and they don't understand what they are doing. So I think it's really important for them to understand that what we are telling them, it's good for them. It's good, they're going to get more clients, they're going to be better, and they're going to make more money. I think that's really important.
Well, but let's be realistic. I mean, you have a lot of business models that don't necessarily make more money if you introduce compliance programs. I mean, if you look at the car sector at the moment, I think we have a very good example from a big company that has the slogan Das Auto, and they, I think, have not had their compliance in place, but had they had their compliance in place, they probably would have sold less diesel cars. And a similar company that I work worked with, I mean, used to work with in the Baltic states was distributing cars all over the Baltic states. And it turned out that, of course, all the dealers were fixing prices and coordinating their activities. So now they have got the biggest fine in the history of the Baltic states, and the compliance guys are coming in. But quite frankly, if the compliance had been in place earlier, I'm not sure if they would have had any money. So I think this is you know, it's a conflict of interest in a way. And I think we're all aware of this as lawyers from many other areas that we work with.
I think also that in this connection, and your point is well taken, for example, when you have a multinational acting in many countries, the first concern that you have when you want to implement a compliance program is that you have budgetary restraints. I mean, you would love to make the best program ever all over the world, and they say, okay, but this is your budget. So what you may have to do is prioritize which are the countries that are riskier, which are the risks, how do we implement, and as somebody said earlier, it may have to be tailor-made somehow to the different countries to fit, first to cover the most serious risks more urgently, to meet budgetary constraints, etc. So it's not a one-size-fits-all easy approach to compliance when you have also a big company, but there are minimum standards. And nowadays, I think that there's enough experience that when you do things wrong, it may really destroy your companies. And we can come up with a number of examples of companies that not only have faced significant fines, but then they have difficulties finding the best people because nobody wants to work for a company that has been on the papers all over the world.
That's an extremely important, I mean, both points were extremely important and extremely interesting because that's true. Some people say compliance only teaches people how to better hide that they are violating the laws. Huh? And especially that, as you rightly said, compliance costs a lot of money sometimes. If you want to be compliant, that means that you will have a higher cost. And if your competitor is not compliant, maybe he will have a lower cost. So maybe there will be he will have a competitive advantage. So on one hand, that is true. But on the other hand, if you see what will happen now to this Das Auto company when their compliance has failed, one of the largest manufacturer of cars can simply go under the water because they were not compliant, because they will have huge fines, huge claims, they have lost reputation, they'll probably not be selling cars anymore in the same amounts. So somehow, yes, compliance is a cost, but not being compliant can mean simply that you will go bust. So from that perspective, I think that that's one of the main messages for the clients, although clients don't like to be scared by lawyers, and you have to be very careful with that. But one of the key messages is that, of course, compliance will cost you money, but in fact, it's an investment. It's not a cost, it's an investment. I don't know whether you want to comment on that.
Yeah, there's always a cost-benefit analysis, and people are there to do business. For example, I'm aware of a case where a particular position had to be taken regarding contract labor, and there were 4 major facility management companies in India, they're still there. And one of them took a position which was more aggressive, and the other 3 said, okay, we will comply and we'll take a conservative position. And the first company got a 50% market share. Now they took a position, but they see the benefit in that.
If I may just, I think perhaps we could take a step back and discuss what the purpose of compliance are. I think there are several purposes, and we've been discussing, as you also mentioned, that it comes with a cost, but of course also it comes with advantages. And I think, in my view, it is basically a limitation of risks. And if I think from my client's perspective, it is limitation of risk for the shareholder on the one hand, avoiding losses, for example, losses through fines, or in the case of Volkswagen, through loss of sales and reputation, although I didn't suggest that they will go down. But, and the second area is a limitation of risk for the board and the management, and this is, of course, concerning liability and in interest of management. So there's a very clear incentive for management to take care of this. But also, I think there are other interests involved, for example, employees' interests. And we discussed yesterday with the colleagues from India the terrible case of Union Carbide in Bhopal many years ago, when more than 10,000 people died because these guys were simply breaking the rules. And you could see all of these three aspects involved. Union Carbide had a huge loss. Management was taken, even in America, was taken to be liable, because apparently, as we were explained by Indian law, the mother company can also be held liable. Plus, of course, 10,000 of workers died, and then even outside of the company, the people, well, I don't have to explain to you. But I mean, so I think these are the three perspectives that you can look at compliance: shareholders, management, and the employees.
But so to sum up, like the first part of the discussion, maybe we will make a quick voting and try to establish whether we agree on the key issues for successful for building the compliance into the company's culture. So understand that one issue that we all agree is the voice from the top. All agree, okay. And I can give you a very good example for that, that is really important. I had once I had a training for a client that has been somehow ordered by the mother company. They have just taken over this Polish subsidiary and they wanted to implement the compliance program, and they asked me to come there and make a presentation or training for the employees. And then when I was making the training, it was on competition law, the main, let's say, enemy in the room was the president of the board. Whenever I said something, he was making like, do you think it's really necessary? What was the fine? And then he was showing with his old attitude that whatever I say, it's not really important. And why he was doing so? Because he was just taken over, his sales were going down, and he understood that I'm scaring his salespeople to tell him, you cannot talk to the competitors, you cannot do this, you cannot do this. So he was afraid that in fact I will ruin his business even more. So he was not prepared, they didn't talk to him, they didn't prepare him, he didn't understand this, and then suddenly there's a lawyer coming and telling things that he doesn't like. So what was the outcome of this session? His people understood that compliance is totally unimportant because their boss was telling them, don't listen to this guy. And then I asked the company, why did you do it? It was so stupid. We lost the opportunity to make it. Yeah, you know, there was a pressure of time. We had no time to discuss. These guys were pushing us, so we did it this way. But that's not a compliance. That's uncompliance. So
I think the point you make is always very important. I think that whenever you do a training, you have to pick the points that show to management why this is important for them, basically. I think that's crucial. It's not an imposition of the company. Their own liability may be engaged, their own career may be engaged. I think the issue of what is there in for you, meaning you, the senior management, is crucial to engage them in the process.
Yes.
And whenever there's a deliberate non-compliance or a fraud at the top level, it's the most difficult to detect.
Sorry, I totally agree what you said, because I've been to a lot of trainings and what you just said, it rings a bell, no? It's really, and of course it's normal, no? Because you go to someone else's place and you tell them how to do their work, and that's not nice. So imagine you someone coming to your house and telling you how to cook an omelette. It's the way you do it, and you've been doing this your whole life, no? So it's really important from my point of view, which is their motivation to do this, because sometimes it's a requirement from the board, it's a requirement from providers, it's just a matter of fine. So you have to really understand which is their motivation, and as you said, you have to work on that and start from that point and just keep on building up a compliance programs, because otherwise, if you want to go there and change the thing they've been done for years, it's really, really impossible to do it, and they probably will do it in the first period, but after a year, you'll have to come back there and nothing is going to be done yet. So it's really important to understand their reasons.
Okay, so that's one. The second point, to fit it into the company's culture. Would you agree?
Yes.
Okay, so that's the second important thing. And the third important thing is probably repetition.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, great. So we all agree?
I didn't raise my hand here.
Is there anything else?
No, I completely, from an idealistic point of view, I think it's wonderful what you've said, but Spain and privacy, it doesn't go like this. Reputation is not something that companies are counting on. It's just, I'm sorry to insist on that, but it's just about fines. It's like this. I'm so sorry, but just big companies that might have a culture and another motivations, but for small companies, it's just about fines. If they can be fined, then it's the main reason why they do this.
I would say another important element of a compliance program is oversight, because there's nothing like a best or the good enough program. It has to evolve over time.
Yeah. Okay, so to finish the first part of the discussion with this conclusion, then maybe we can move into implementation, because we have more or less discussed what is compliance, what are the requirements for compliance. But then my next question to the panel would be, let's now assume that you have a client and the client is telling you, as an experienced advisor, what shall I do to implement the compliance program? What is the plan, what we shall do, etc. So what would be your advice regarding implementation of compliance programs?
Maybe in the first step would be to connect to our previous comments. I think you have to pick up the management and you have to motivate them to actually implement the compliance program in the organization. And I think this would be the first step. And I think we've already mentioned a few positive points of compliance, and I would like to add one more that comes from, again, my perspective, working with companies that are in several jurisdictions. I think it's a tremendous opportunity to integrate the organization. I think it is something that a lot of also law firms that are in several countries have to deal with all the time, that the organization tends to drift apart in the different jurisdictions that they are. And I think this is a very good opportunity to sit down together and become more one organization. So this would be one additional point to motivate the management to put this into place, so that you don't sit there and have these guys look at you and say, oh, the lawyer again, he's so boring.
Thing that I would do to start with is analyze which are the processes of the company. I mean, because if the company has good processes in place, you can build your compliance program on the basis of those control processes. If when you review the processes, as in the case of the company I was saying that was operating in very separated silos, then what you have to do is start working together with the different sections of the company to integrate the control processes, so that you know that whatever is a purchase order here ends up being paid there and follows a clear chain. So that's another thing I would do before just superimposing a compliance program without having analyzed, without having a diagnosis of how the company works.
And I think we will need some tools also to implement a program, something like a good software. We will need some recording systems, some documentation systems, some checklists, and of course, training is more important. You may have all these tools, but if people are not trained, they're worthless.
Yeah,
this is like real estate, location, location, location. In this case, is training, training, training.
Yeah, I do think to imply like a compliance program is really important to involve several different steps or several levels from the organization, like the CEO, of course, it has to be aware of that compliance programs, the CTO in case of privacy and security, marketing and human resources. I think they are the main people that they have to be aware, and they have to really understand what's, in this case, privacy about. In Spain, it's really typical that there's this guy who takes care about privacy. And nobody wants to talk with him, nobody wants to see him in their office, and this is this guy. So we have to start working, like it has to be like a more interdepartmental like thing, like several areas has to be involved on that. And of course, you have to set controls and you have to set reviews. And as you said, training, I think it's important, which is not binding nowadays in Spain for privacy, but I think it's one of the main things also to be aware of.
I think we mentioned, most of the things that we mentioned have to do with communication and the organization, and I would perhaps, my suggestion would be to sum it together and say you have to at first work on the communication, how you start the process. Of course, as I said, it can be an opportunity, but I think the worst case scenario is what we talked about earlier, that you just come with a rule book from somewhere else and just implement it, because then nobody really feels taken seriously.
I would fully agree. I think that the worst experience you can have as an advisor trying to help to implement the compliance program is the situation where you come to the client and you understand that they have no idea why they want to do this. And sometimes this happens. I mean, they've heard on a conference that compliance is really a fashionable thing, everybody has it, my competitor has it, so we should also have it. And then they ask you for the meeting and tell you, so please now tell us what we should do to implement the compliance program. And that will never work. That will never work. I mean, you cannot invent a compliance program for somebody. He has to invent the compliance program and you can only help. So I think that the first and the most important role of the advisor is to be rather a guide and to say, you can do this way, you can have this and this tool. I mean, IT is also, I fully agree with Atul, IT tools are becoming more and more important in this area. So you can only guide them, but if they expect you to do the work for them, this will never work. I don't know whether you agree or not. So the first thing is to really make people understand why we are doing this. And then only when you have this understanding, you can move forward and start to think how you want to achieve this goal. But the first thing is the understanding, and the understanding has to come, as we said, from the top management. And then, of course, I mean, the next thing is tools, how you want to achieve that. I know whether you would like to comment on that. I mean, from your perspective, which tools of implementing compliance programs are the more effective? Is it only about training? Is it more about rules? Is it more about ITs? Is it more about simply sending the message more and more often through various chains of communication? Or do you have to do everything a bit to have this done?
Yeah, sorry. I do think that the main tool is human resources. So if the people are aware about what they are doing and which are the alerts that they have to think about something, it might be wrong here, something might go wrong, and then we should ask what we should do. I think the people are the most important resources to really have an effective compliance programs, because you can work on IT, you can have several IT tools, but if you don't have people really working on that and really understanding what does it mean, I think it doesn't work. You need someone inside the organization that really understands what's that about, and someone really motivated and that understand what's have to be done.
And then also, what we have to keep in mind is that compliance programs also are highly dependent on the industry you're working. Some industries are much more riskier than other industries, not alone the size of the company where the problems may be bigger, but if you are, for example, a pharmaceutical company, or if you are, I mean, in certain areas that are particular, or you're in the banking area, whatever, then the risks are much larger. So the training, the involvement, the culture, etc., has to be somehow enhanced because of the size of the risk attached to the specific industry.
Another important ingredient of a good compliance program is to get feedback from the people who are using that program, and also do a compliance audit which can be part of the internal audit. And only then you'll be able to improve the system. The tools have to be continuously be improved to ensure that it's in line with the current legal situation. And also it's something which people are willing to do. Like there are certain voluntary compliances, like getting people to attend this session after the gala dinner, so you can see that end.
One point that I wanted to stress is sometimes the compliance program is not necessarily isolated. For example, if the remuneration system of the company is very much focused on commissions for sales, or prices for sales, or bonus for sales in a very enhanced manner, that may lead people to do incorrect things. So this is just an example of how you have to align every aspect of the company to make sure that you're not giving wrong signals and that this is coherent with what you're claiming you're putting together with your compliance program.
I couldn't agree more on that. I mean, that's really extremely important.
Do you want to be my client? I mean, you're an ideal client.
Well, I think we simply have the same experience, and that allows us to agree on so many issues. But I fully agree that sometimes where there is a breach or gap between the compliance and the business goals, and then on one hand you say to the people you need to comply, and on the other hand you stress them to sell and sell more, and you don't even tell them, or you don't watch carefully how they do this, then it will not work, and then you will not have a compliance. I also agree with Atul's comments about improvements. The compliance program, to be effective, it has to be alive. If people see within the organization that the company is learning from its mistakes, that it's analyzing its mistakes, that these mistakes are discussed, and you want to do this better next time, of course this will translate into a compliance culture. If you do mistakes and you do not attach importance to this, or you don't learn from your mistakes and you repeat them, then of course you will fail. Because you have to also, I think, explain to the clients from the very, very beginning that somehow, because of the human nature, even the best compliance program will never make you 100% secure. There always will be problems. But simply because you have compliance program in place, you will be better placed to deal with those problems. Yeah? But then, and when you deal with them correctly, then it improves your compliance program. So it's a living thing. And that also shows to the people that this is something important.
Yeah, and if the compliance program has been well set in place, problems will arise before becoming serious problems. You will identify flaws in the system, or you should identify problems that you are able to fix and not wake up one morning with a huge crisis.
Okay, so then maybe one question to somehow finish this part of the discussion, then maybe we'll allow for some questions or comments from the audience. Maybe a more specific one. Clients often ask when they implement compliance program, who should deal with compliance issues? Should this be a legal department? Should this be the auditing department? Should this be internal controls department, or maybe we should establish a separate compliance officer? And again, so that would be my question. I mean, from your experience, how you would see this? Is this only a tool for lawyers, or is this a tool for somebody else, or task for somebody else, or is this an interdisciplinary thing? How you would see this from your perspective, from the perspective of experience?
I think it all depends on the budget which the company has. Sometimes the CFO is even doing the job of a general counsel, depending on the size of the company. So depending on the scale of the operations of the company, I think you may need a compliance officer, you may need internal controls and internal auditor to check on the compliance procedures.
It's the company is big enough, I would say the much the better. So if you have more people involved, you're probably going to be more successful in the future. Coming back to privacy law, there's this figure which is called data protection officer that in some occasions it's going to be mandatory and it has to be included inside the organization. It's going to be the guy who's going to be at the head of the compliance program.
Well, I think obviously it would have to be on all levels. I think it would have to be the management that convincingly explains to the organization that this is a priority for the organization, that has to work together with the legal department to understand the issues. I mean, we mentioned, for example, management liability. I mean, if the legal department is sufficiently able to explain to the management that it's their own, in most countries, private liability that's involved, then that should motivate them to also take this seriously. But of course, there should be lower levels in the organization, compliance officers that have the trust of the employees and of everybody, that can communicate this into the organization in such a way that they don't just feel it like a top-down exercise. So I think it has to be both on management and on the employee level, and the lawyers, of course, are somewhere in between, but they should also, in an ideal case, be approachable, so that an employee, through hotline like that we will hear more about later will be able to ask legal questions. I mean, what happens, like you mentioned the 500 rupee case, what happens if I take the 500 rupees from a customer? What should I do with this email that I'm getting if somebody's offering me to in a public procurement procedure, which I mentioned the car dealerships, this is very, very frequent practice, at least in the region that I work in, that emails go around and people get offered public procurement opportunities, but of course there are kickbacks involved. So what am I going to do with this? So I have to be able as an employee, without fearing any bad repercussions for myself, to approach the legal department and ask questions.
I mean, whether it's a specific person, a compliance officer, whether it's the general counsel, whether it's the CFO, I mean, it will all depend on the company. What you have to make sure is that in somebody's job description, there's enough time allotted to do this work, because what happens sometimes is this work is given to someone who is also given 10 or 12 other tasks, and at the end of the day, there's no time to do it. So depending on the size of the company, depending on the complexity of the industry, depending on that, it may justify to have a specific person, more than one person, the same general counsel, or someone else. But basically what you have to make sure is that someone is having enough time to keep an eye on the subject.
Like some years ago, none of the big four accounting firms in India used to have a general counsel. It's only internally the partners used to look after legal issue thinking they know enough of law. It's only when 2-3 accounting scams were discovered, all of them now have a general counsel.
Well, to sum up, I think that I agree that there is no universal solution. But from my perspective, I think that there's one thing to add. If you want somebody to take care of the compliance, he or she has to have enough authority within the organization. The worst mistake you can do is, just like Victor said, to take the people that nobody likes, the person that nobody likes and has nothing to do, and say, okay, you have nothing to do, so now you'll be our compliance officer. And then people will ignore him or her, and it will never work. If you want to have a compliance program in place, you need to have a person with the authority. Be it a member of the board that is responsible for compliance, be it somebody from the top of the management that is responsible. We can create a separate new role within the organization that is responsible for compliance, but still it has to be a person with the authority. Otherwise, it will never work.
I agree.
Okay, so I think that we are coming to the end of the discussion. I would like to ask the audience, if there are any questions, comments from your perspective, or maybe there are questions to the panel. Yes.
Bonjour, Bénédicte Anne, avocat à Paris. Ma question, vous avez évoqué les IT tools. Est-ce que vous pourriez décrire un tout petit peu plus qu'est-ce que vous utilisez ou qu'est-ce que vous conseillez d'utiliser comme IT tools?
As far as my experience is concerned, it really depends on the industry. For example, I was working with a company that sells prepaid cards for managing corporate expenses, and the IT tool they developed together with what we wanted for the compliance officer to have this as a red flag was to see patterns of unusual activity. For example, if a company regularly bought so much blocks of money to cover expenses, and all of a sudden you see something which is unusual, that was a red flag that had to be checked. So this is the type of IT tools, information in a consistent manner that will show in a graphic something that is unusual. That's a possibility. There are many others.
Yes, and I think also for trainings, IT is more and more often used. I mean, you have the online virtual rooms where people can get trained, and also systems that remind them that they should take this training or that training. So that's another area. Whistleblowing, they are also outside companies that provide this service. and we have clients that are using this outsourced whistleblowing assistance services. So I think that IT is becoming more and more important. You can also use IT tools simply to verify compliance. We have been recently involved in a project, a multinational project, when on a one rainy morning we have simply arrived to the company with people from the headquarters and with 2 guys from London, and these London guys, they had a small black case, and they simply downloaded all the data from the computers, mobile phones of every single important employee within the subsidiary, and then we have been analyzing email by email as message after message whether there is a compliance. And again, on the first, you could think it was a very aggressive manner of doing a compliance, but not in that case, because people were informed after the exercise why they are doing this, that this is a part of the compliance, that it will help them to behave better in the future because we will be able to identify problematic situations better. And I think in the end it was a very positive exercise for the company, even if it was quite drastic. And people didn't like it in the very beginning that somebody is taking my phone, my computer, but then they also realized that it may happen one day. A competition authority may come and they do exactly the same thing. But of course this again requires an IT tool. So I think that there will be more and more use of IT tools for that.
Another thing that I would like to ask the panel and the audience is the issue of the whistleblower. The issue of the whistleblower still, I think, raises issues. Oh, sorry.
Well, you have introduced the second.
No, I mean, raises a lot of issues in connection with cultures, and I leave the appetizer, as you said. Sorry.
As there are a lot of corruption in the private sector, and there are a lot of reports which say that 40 to 50% of the corruption actually emanates from the private sector. There are certain forensic IT tools also available these days where you can, there are these red flags which come up to show that there is a problem somewhere.
Well, I mean, to chair a panel, it can be a nightmare, it can be a real pleasure. If you have good panelists, it's really a fantastic experience, and I would like to thank my panel. It was really very, very... there's a question, I'm sorry. If there's a question, I'm very sorry, I didn't notice that. So yeah. There are 2 questions. Wow, that's great, that's great.
Hello, my name is Uli Baumann. I was going to add some comments to your question about IT tools or software tools to be compliant, and I made an experience in Germany where I worked together with a company who is doing technical compliance. Under technical compliance you can understand technical rules which are set up by the government, by certain institutes, environmental compliance, and there exist on the market some software tools which allows you to adapt for each company, or to identify first technical and environmental dangerous situations, problems, which you can then solve by asking questions to your staff, which is defined to control these questions, to answer these questions, and to define a period when they have to check this and report it by just clicking. And if this employee does not fulfill his duty looking after these problems or resolving these internal problems, which are prescribed by these technical regulations, then there shows a yellow flag and a red flag. And this is very helpful to introduce maybe, well, we are talking all the time about legal compliance, but compliance is also an issue on technical rules, on environmental rules, and there you can catch your staff much easier by implementing such a software tool, because they are much more aware of what they have to bring, what they have to do, what they have to check, because what does the software? The software just scans all technical rules and environmental rules and is translating these laws into questions and answers. And this is a very simple approach to start with compliance in an enterprise, yeah? Thank you.
Are there any more questions, comments?
Just regarding the IT, I think one of the simplest IT applications that I've seen is companies that simply scan emails for certain keywords, which is super easy. I mean, you basically just have to connect some sort of Google type. I don't know, I'm not an IT guy, obviously, but if just certain keywords pop up, I mean, kickback, it's probably not, you know, but if something like this in one way or another pops up, then the red flag goes on.
Bonjour, Alain Grosjean de l'étude Bonne-Schmidt, Luxembourg. Je vous remercie d'abord de ce départ de commentaires, je les ai trouvés très intéressants. Moi, je travaille beaucoup sur la protection des données. C'est vrai que jusqu'à présent, la compliance était réservée au secteur financier, réservée au secteur d'assurance. Maintenant, c'est la protection des données, ça va toucher toutes les entreprises, tous les individus qui manient ce type de données. Donc on est à une autre échelle. Maintenant, je me pose la question, par rapport au nouveau règlement, sur la place de l'avocat dans la compliance. Dans cette législation, on met beaucoup l'accent sur le chargé, le délégué à la protection des données, qui n'est pas forcément un avocat. Cette législation est très technique, elle nécessite l'intervention d'un avocat, mais l'acteur central, c'est le délégué à la chargé à la protection des données. L'avocat, quand il aide au niveau de la compliance, au niveau de la protection des données, il y a des problèmes de sécurité informatique, il y a des problèmes, souvent, bon, ça c'est réservé souvent aux informaticiens, il y a des problèmes de normes, on va appliquer des normes, donc c'est souvent les consultants, l'avocat n'est pas tant habitué, en tous les cas en Europe, à appliquer ces normes, ça existe, il y a des cabinets d'avocats qui sont spécialisés en tout et qui le font. Comment vous envisagez la place de l'avocat et est-ce qu'on ne devrait pas le former pour maintenant répondre à ces exigences, je le répète, alors que maintenant la majorité des acteurs vont être soumis à ces normes de compliance, enfin d'accountability, parce que ça va au-delà de la pure compliance en matière de protection des données. Est-ce que vous avez un avis sur ce sujet? Merci.
I do think we still have place because even though it's true that when you're working on privacy things, you have to be really aware of what's going on IT. So I really do think that you need someone inside the organization that understands the IT complexity of that organization. Of course, you have to work together with him. And as I said before, this new concept, which is privacy by design, where the lawyers, I think, will be still important, where we have to understand which kind of data is going to be processed. And of course, regarding this data and understanding the risk with the IT guy, we have to give them solutions and to give them proper measures in order to secure this data. So I really do think we still have a place. But of course, working or understanding really good which is the IT structure of the company. Otherwise, it's just giving advices without really knowing what's going on. So I really think, I believe we still have work to do, no?
You should always convince clients that lawyers are the most important. But in fact, I think that for this, lawyers can be important also in that sense that you have touched upon an isolated area of law that companies need to comply with, and most of the companies need to comply with data protection law, and lawyers can also be a bridge between different types of compliance and different areas of compliance. And if you are really into a compliance thing, you can advise clients how to combine all those different areas into something that is a compliance policy. And that's what we often do, that you don't talk to the client about compliance with regards to competition law or compliance with regards to environmental law, but you discuss with them a compliance policy that will cover all those areas. And that's also an important role for the lawyer as an advisor to help clients to put all those different pieces into something that will work well. So I think that that could be also a very important role of the lawyers. But we cannot steal more time from our colleagues from the next panel. Thank you very much for all this discussion. The really interesting part is coming now, because we have discussed what is compliance, but as we said, if you have a compliance, you will have a problem, and the next panel will discuss what to do with this problem. Thank you.